Welcome to the Bay Area Global Health Seminar Series. My name is Eva Harris, and I'm a professor in the Division of Infectious Diseases and Vaccinology in the School of Public Health, and also the faculty director of the Center for Global Public Health. And we're very happy to welcome everybody on behalf of UC Berkeley. This is the first of the Bay Area Global Health Seminars that we are hosting here. It's actually the third in the series, and the first was in January of 2014, and that was at UCSF. And it was on the global HIV/AIDS at the crossroads. And then we've had a second one, which is at Stanford, and that was about investing in health and universal health coverage, and that was in March of 2014. And now this is the third, and as you know, it's on essentially Global Health Action on a Crowded Earth, Bay Area Perspectives on Population Growth, Environment, and Public Health. And so this is a consortium of 4 universities in the Bay Area: UC Davis, UC Berkeley, UCSF, and Stanford. And the idea is to have these seminars that bring people together from all of the 4 universities around diverse topics in global health. And we're really excited to have people here from all 4 schools. And so just a word about the Center for Global Public Health. It's actually a center on campus that does diverse activities in the area of public health in both education and research, and also sending students and others overseas to our partner countries and regions. And we also collaborate not just within the School of Public Health, but across campus, and then certainly across universities like our partners UCSF, UC Davis, and Stanford. And so we have a special welcome, because this is actually the first time that we've had all 4 faculty directors here of the Bay Area Global Health Seminar, which is Stefano Bertozzi, who will be moderating, and Jaime Sepulveda, who's the director of the Global Health Sciences at UCSF, and Michelle Berry, who's director of the Global Health Center at Stanford, and Pat Conrad, respective director at UC Davis. So a warm welcome to all of you. It's taken 9 or so months to be able to get everybody in one place at one time, but we're very thrilled this is the time. So welcome. And I also want to have a special thanks to the staff and support network across all 4 schools, and especially to Hildy Fong, who's the executive director of the CGPH here at Berkeley, and our work study students, Remy, Yagana, and Caroline, and then also to Catherine Lee, who kind of managed all the rest from UCSF at Global Health Sciences. And last but not least, our wonderful panelists who are here comfortably seated on stage. And we're going to actually have, I'm going to introduce Ndola Prada, who will then introduce our panelists. And Ndola is the director of the Bixby Center for Population Health and Sustainability here at UC Berkeley, and she will be taking the stage next. I believe, yes, here she is. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Eva, for the introduction. And welcome all to the Bay Area Global Health Seminar. I will start by saying that the world's population is estimated today at over 7 billion and is expected to grow to 8.9 billion by 2050. We do recognize the health implications that changes in size and composition of the population can bring, and I believe that it is imperative to include a public health perspective in the ongoing debate over possible consequences and viable solutions. The health of women and girls, their reproductive rights and fertility desires should be at the center of this debate. It is estimated that more than 220 million women have an unmet need for contraception, and meeting this need could help, among other things, reduce fertility, particularly the unwanted fertility, and this can also help decrease population growth. Even in the US, where fertility is relatively low, around 50% of births are unwanted every year. In sub-Saharan Africa, for example, where high fertility still prevails, a net increase in population resulting from natural growth will account for a large part of the change in population size. In other parts of the world, most of the growth will come from population momentum. This momentum is fueled by large cohorts created from previous high fertility regimes. This illustrates that even when fertility falls, the population continues to grow due to the momentum, and challenges related to rapid urbanization, use of natural resources, and environment degradation will continue to be issues of concern for health outcomes. Today, we will hear from experts from various Bay Area universities. They will describe what they believe are critical factors to address regarding the global health impact of population growth. So our first panelist will be Jenna Davis. She's Associate Professor in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering and Senior Fellow at Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment. Welcome, Jenna.
Thanks.
Ted Miguel will be our second panelist. Ted Miguel is the Oxford Professor in Environmental and Resource Economics in the Department of Economics at UC Berkeley, and he's also the Director of the Center for Effective Global Action, CIGA. Howard Diana Shapiro will be our third panelist, and Howard is a Senior Fellow in the Department of Plant Sciences at UC Davis. Our last panelist will be David Vlahov, and David is the Dean of School of Nursing at UCSF. Moderating this excellent panel will be the Dean of School of Public Health at UC Berkeley, Stefano Bertozzi. So I would now welcome once again our panelists and moderator, and welcome all of you to this debate. Each panelist will have about 5 minutes to make their case, and the panel will be moderated by Stefano. Thank you.
Thanks, Ndola. So as it's interesting, I had thought of it as a debate more than a discussion, but maybe we'll get to the point of debate. But we thought it would be nice to kick it off with a sort of a lightning round with introductory comments from everybody. So I'm going to ask everybody really to try to keep it to 5 minutes so that we can spend most of the time in discussion. I know that's hard, but we'll give it a try. Jenna, you want to take it away?
All right, and you're welcome to sort of, you're within striking distance, so when I start running out of time, just let me know.
Don't look at me, look over there at the clock.
Oh, it's way over there. All right. So I think it might be helpful just to share with you all the prompt that we were given, which was, actually, what is the prompt? What is a critical challenge that we need to address in our lifetime to address the health implications of global population growth? And so I should lead off by saying that most of my research and teaching focuses on water supply and sanitation services in low and middle income countries. So at the top of my list, or the first response that I had to that prompt was identifying new workable urban sanitation models. However, I know that David wants to focus a lot of his comments on this linkage between urbanization, population growth, and health. So I thought instead I'd shift to the water side and maybe make some broad comments about water population growth and health, and maybe just try to get a few issues on the table. So Ndola, it won't be my case to the jury. But I think that in most cases, at least what I'm seeing now, when people write or talk about population growth and water, it's in a framework of water scarcity. And most people are invoking a notion of physical water scarcity when they use this term. And what do we mean by that? The sort of FAO definition that's widely used is that a country or a region faces water scarcity if it can supply fewer than 500 cubic meters of fresh water per person per year. And it's water stressed if that volume is between 500 and 1,000 cubic meters per year. Okay, so if you think about the fact that, so the statistics we have are currently we've got 1.2 billion people living in areas with water scarcity. By 2025, that goes to 1.8 billion. In the same year, 2025, 2/3 roughly of the global population is projected to live in areas that are facing water stress, so between 500 and 1,000 cubic meters per person per annum. So this is not surprising, right? It's a ratio. It's available fresh water and people. And this is fixed. This isn't changing, but the number of people is getting bigger. So the fact that more and more people are being classified as living in water-stressed or water-scarce areas isn't surprising. The question is, what are the implications for health, or at least the relevant question for this panel? And I think it's curious, for me personally, as sort of a water person, that those statistics about water scarcity are quickly followed by statistics regarding access to domestic water supply and sanitation services, right? So just to put us on the same page, Currently, about 800 million people around the world are still using unimproved water sources, so rivers, lakes, ponds, unprotected springs. 2.5 billion people don't have access to even the most basic toilet, right? So what does water scarcity have to do with access to water and sanitation services? It's relevant for this conversation about health because I hope I don't have to make the case that water and sanitation services are really critical to health. I'm going to assume that this group is on board with that premise and ask the other question: what does water scarcity have to do with access to domestic water supply and sanitation services? And historically, my answer to that question has been not much, not much. And I'll offer two pieces of supporting evidence. I actually want you to generate one of them. Think of a country or a region within a country that you would guess would qualify for that water scarce label, right? Very arid, very dry place. But that also has high levels of water supply service for the people who live there. Got it. So most oil-rich countries in the Middle East fall in this category. Right? Very little fresh water to work with, very high levels of service. The Western United States classifies. They have both of these characteristics. They're officially water scarce, but 24/7, very high levels of water service. And in fact, there is no statistical association between the amount of fresh water available in a country and the percentage of people in that country that have access to basic water services. Right? So I actually get kind of frustrated and a little annoyed when I'm working in low and middle income countries and I'm told by decision makers that, oh, Professor Jenna, there's no way we can get good water service to everyone in our country. We're so water scarce, right? That's kind of a red herring. The second piece of evidence I'll just throw at you is, of all the fresh water that we abstract for human use on the planet, only about 7 or 8% gets diverted to these domestic uses, right? It's a very small share. So the domestic water sector is, of course, critical, right? It's critical for public health. But in the big scheme of things, when you're thinking about water and population growth and health, I think there's kind of bigger fish to fry. So I'll throw out a couple of those that I think my colleagues will build on. The first is that I think that figuring out how to get enough water to 8.9 billion people for drinking, cooking, and bathing and washing is much less challenging than figuring out how to find the water to grow the food to feed the 8.9 billion people, right? That's where most of the fresh water is going. And not only do we have more people showing up on the planet, but the ones who are already here are getting wealthier, right? So what they want to eat is changing, and in particular, they want to eat more meat. And I know Howard knows much more about this than I, and will fill in the blanks and educate me a lot, but the statistic I've always held on to is producing 1 kilogram of animal protein requires about 100 times more water than producing a kilogram of grain protein, right? So as we also increase our standard of living and want to be more affluent and have what we consider more affluent diets, the water implications are really huge. And the second thing, I'll finish with this, try to stay in my time, and hopefully tee up the comments that David will be making, is this issue of urbanization. We are seeing unprecedented rates of city growth in the global south. It creates a lot of challenges across the board with respect to water and sanitation and health, and I'm sure that David's going to touch on many of those. So I'll just offer one that is more from the environmental side. Across the globe, we are investing a tremendous amount of resources, energy, time, money in moving water to cities from farther and farther away, right? The cheap sources have been exploited, and we're really, really fundamentally changing landscapes, ecosystems, et cetera, in order to continue to feed cities that are growing at unprecedented rates. So I think just something to put on the table is the implications of that for public health through the threatening of ecosystem function, right, in areas around cities is something else worth considering. Thanks.
Thanks, Jenna. That was very close to 5 minutes.
Thanks.
I think you went only 2 over. So we're going to just continue our lightning round before we open it up to broader discussion. But of course, they can build on each other. So Ted, it's yours.
Great. Thanks for having me here. I'm a development economist. I mainly work on African economic development. The public health issue that I want to focus on today and that I focus on in my research is the issue of violence. So not maybe the first public health issue or health issue that comes to mind, but certainly a very important one, and one that accounts for a lot of human suffering and morbidity around the world. I've been working for the past decade or so trying to understand the links between economic scarcity and resource scarcity and violence, that connection. It's an economic issue, it's a health issue, it's a political issue. And my research in this area actually started when I was doing field work for another project in rural Tanzania in 2001, 2002. I was working in an area that was a semi-arid area, an area that would be classified as water scarce, I think, based on Jenna's classification. And we were collecting survey data to try to understand local public goods provision and education provision. And I started hearing about and talking to people about really a terrible tragedy that was going on in this part of Tanzania, and that's widespread in western Tanzania, which is the attack and killing of people accused of being witches. So you might say, what does that have to do with anything? It turns out when we got data, we got historical data on rainfall, we got historical data on drought years in this part of Tanzania, and different villages and different regions had good years and bad years. There were huge spikes in attacks on these witches in drought years. So in years when the rains failed, there was this outbreak of violence. Now, as an economist, I saw an immediate connection to economic development outcomes. This region of western Tanzania was an overwhelmingly agrarian, still is an overwhelmingly agrarian region. Almost everybody, 90-something% of people, lived off their own farm. They grew food on their own farm. And when the rains failed, their crops failed, and there's almost no irrigation in this region, and people went hungry. And it was exactly in those years where there was an outbreak of violence. There's also a very strong gender dimension to the violence that we collected data on, and this touches on Ndola's sort of introductory comments. Almost all the people accused and killed as witches were women, and they tended to be older women. So there was a very strong gendered aspect to the violence. And anyway, we collected data on a dozen years across scores of villages. We found this relationship. Since then, I've been working on trying to understand this link between resource scarcity and violence, mainly in Africa, but I've also been studying it in some other regions. And there's a very large research literature that's emerged around these issues in economics and political science, in history. Climate scientists are working on these issues. Sociologists are working on these issues. And there are some really striking patterns that emerge when you put all that data together. So I've been working with co-authors Solomon Shang, who's here in the Public Policy School, and Marshall Burke, who just graduated from Berkeley and got a job at Stanford in working in environment. We got all the data we could get our hands on this public health issue of violence from economists, from political scientists across all these fields to try to see if there was any sort of pattern that came out in the data. And we find a very strong link between extreme climatic outcomes, very high temperatures, drought years, extreme flooding, so extreme weather outcomes that in low-income settings tend to be associated with poor economic outcomes when most people rely on rain-fed agriculture. We find very strong links between those extreme climatic outcomes and violence. And we tried to be as comprehensive as we could in looking at different forms of violence. In fact, we got 56 papers. So we got data from all these papers. We pooled them together in a meta-analysis in a paper that came out last year. And we find very striking patterns. Whether you're talking about crime, violent crime, murder, rape, assault, you find this relationship. Extreme climate is associated with more violence. When you look at organized political violence, things like civil conflict and civil war, which is very widespread in sub-Saharan Africa, my region of expertise, so 80% of African countries have had at least 1 year of civil conflict since 1980. So the vast majority of countries have had it. When you look at that outcome, again, you find a very strong relationship between high temperatures, drought, and the incidence of this form of violence. So, the way that this pattern that we find across dozens of studies ties into the theme of today's session is, well, first of all, the world continues to warm, so environmental and resource scarcity is only going to get worse in many parts of the world as we get 2, 3, 4 degrees Celsius warmer in the next 40 or 50 years. And rising population growth in some of the poorest regions of the world, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, may exacerbate all of these this resource scarcity. So, I think that's the problem that I'm really concerned about. That's the sort of challenge for our lifetime, in terms of the prompt for today's session that I work on, that I'm interested in, and that I'd love to continue discussing during the open session.
Great. Thanks, Ted.
So I thought I was the Grim Reaper today. And I'm glad my colleague is filling in that role. I should also mention that I'm the Chief Agricultural Officer for Mars Incorporated, the third largest food company in the world, and a senior fellow at the World Agroforestry Center. And what I'd like to relate to, I'll start with the first speaker just momentarily, then dive into a dire set of statistics about human health and nutrition, is that 1 trillion gallons of water, just to think 1 trillion gallons of water, which is 1/4 of all the water used globally for agriculture, is wasted through food spoilage. So that's 1/4 of all the water, of the largest use of water in the world, is wasted every single year, day in and day out, with no attempt to try to figure out how to fix it. I can assure you that all the foundations added up in the world and all the governments added up in the world are doing nothing to try to fix this, except send commodities which are not highly nutritious overseas to get rid of the extra commodities we have through pipe support systems. I just finished the midterm review of what is called the CGIAR system, Consultative Group International Agricultural Research, which is more or less a $1.5 billion, $2 billion endeavor. And in writing the review and the 9 recommendations which have been accepted for the reorganization of the CG, the number 1 criterion, I can read it, was nutrition, that all CGR food, crop, and livestock research should include nutritional improvement as an integral objective with a specific focus on reducing stunting. And I'll get to stunting momentarily. 1/6 of the U.S. population had a food-related illness in 2011, causing 50 million illnesses, 3,000 deaths, and only costing $80 billion. In Africa, 2,000 people die every day from food safety-related illnesses. The grain that's lost in Africa per annum is estimated to be about $4 billion, which could feed 48 million people. Africa imported $65 billion worth of foodstuffs in 2012. Aflatoxin, which is one of my favorite topics, are naturally occurring mycotoxins that are produced by many aspergilluses, mostly Flavus and Parasiticus, found in cassava, cacao, maize, peanuts, millet, rice, sorghum, sunflower seeds, tree nuts, and most spices. That's pretty much the whole range of what people eat. It turns out that 1.5 billion people a day are exposed to aflatoxin in the developing world, with 4.5 billion people a year being exposed. Aflatoxin is a wonderful little, how would you say, fungus, in that it does many, many things. It exacerbates the health challenges in people who are already chronically hungry and malnourished. So there's these programs going on around the world called food security, talking about the 1,000 days, the pregnancy of a woman, and the first 2 to 3 years of a child's life. Well, it really should be 2,000 days, because if you haven't built up the folates and the zinc and the vitamin A and the other micronutrients and vitamins that are needed to establish good health, then the child will be stunted. So what does stunting do? Economically, it reduces your capability, and you're not going to be Einstein, you're not going to be Usain Bolt, you're not going to be Jascha Heifetz, The list goes on what you won't be. But economic disadvantage means that we're creating a class of people around the world that will never reach their potential. Neurologically, you're set back, and physically you're set back. And if you're in a community of everyone being stunted and you look around, you kind of look normal. But the fact is you're not. And when we talk about food security, there needs to be an entire paradigm shift to change it to nutritional security. 7% of the children in the United States are stunted, which seems startling to me. 37% of the rural population of Africa, the children, are stunted. And 50% of the rural children in India are stunted. And India has surplus food. So what's the problem? It's just not nutritious. The stuff that we put on boats to send around the world to help in conflicts, 1980 onward, you could count the conflicts in Africa, in other places. It's just not nutritious. Normally it's fed to cows, pigs, and chickens. So what would happen if we took all the food system and improved the nutrition? And since no one will do that, including the large seed companies, you ask the president of DuPont or the president of Monsanto or the president of BASF or Bayer, what are the nutritional improvements that you've made since 1950 to your crops, which have soared like this in productivity, though that's flattened out now? And they said, we just try to hold on to what we've got. And I can speak about this personally because I've asked all of them to open their archives and give me all their data on how to improve nutrition in crops. So in 2011, we formed the African Orphan Crops Consortium under the African Union and NEPAD. It's a consortium that has no management, no director, no secretariat. And we're training 250 scientists to use molecular biology, marker-assisted selections in Africa to improve the nutrition of 101 food crops that we're doing the sequencing, the assembly and annotation at the Beijing Genomic Institute, known as BGI. All the data is being moved around the world by a Google pipe that they supplied. All the equipment was supplied by Life Technology, which is Thermo Fisher. All the teaching is done by the UC Davis Plant Breeding Academy. All the crops, the 101 crops, were selected by Africans for Africa. So these are the foods that are eaten every single day of the week. So it seems pretty audacious since there's only 57 crops that have been sequenced. And 36 months from now, we'll have 101 more. That's how much technology is trained. But discovery is simple. Translation is hard. And scale-up is even harder. So we're facing these problems. But we decided, this uncommon collaboration decided, that we would do this because nobody else would improve the nutrition of these food crops. So we face this conundrum. You got aflatoxin, you have stunting, you have water shortages. And if I look at the policy that is generated by the European Union or the United States or any other major national group that is sending aid around the world like China, it is so mistaken. It so misses the target. And then we talk, oh, we have plumpy nut. So plumpy nut is a very nice product, costs about $2,700 a metric ton. Never reaches the end of the road. We haven't improved on anything since plumpy nut. It reminds me of the Green Revolution that Norman Borlaug belatedly said when he was 96 years old. Did I ever think that you all would only do what I said in 1970 and continue for 40 years? So plumpy nut fits in that same category. And I should also tell you that one of the most nutritious, well-designed foods in the world are pet care products, dogs, cats, horses, fish. And they run about $400 a metric ton. So somewhere between plumpy nut, which is a single idea, and pet care is a sweet spot of $500, $700, $800 a metric ton with a different model of manufacturing that's owned by Africans or Indians or South Americans, which will deliver this. And if we don't address this problem fundamentally of nutrition, just think about if you were to walk the streets of Berkeley and there was a whole group of people who were stunted and you knew their children would probably be stunted and their children would be stunted. And the horrible thing that people now think that it might be inherited. We're creating a society beneath the society that will never, ever, ever reach its potential? So what is global healthcare? It's certainly not the way it's being described today.
Well, this is the up panel.
Yeah.
So, David.
Well,
finish us
hopefully
off.
I'll end with something positive in all of this. There's some major trends that are going on. Certainly our basic needs in terms of water, sanitation, food, these are very fundamental, but we also have to look at what are the trends of the 21st century. And we think about that as globalization, climate, demographic changes, and urbanization. And I'm going to concentrate on the urbanization because when we look at the population growth that is happening and was described by within the introduction, one of the points to add to that as you're going from the 6 to 8 to 9 billion people on the planet, we're seeing almost all of that growth is going to be happening in urban slums. That's an important point to stick in there and remember. The world is becoming progressively more urbanized. In 2007, 8, 50% of the world was urban. Well, right now we're living in urban area, 85% urban in the United States. So that's not that dramatic, it seems. But now that we look at low middle income countries, we see that 50% will be urban by 2015. So it's a rate of urbanization that we look at going forward. In 2030, it'll be 66% urban, the globe, and in 2050, it'll be 75%. So people are moving to cities. We really have to be able to adjust. Now, one of the approaches that has been in consideration is let's deal with rural poverty. Is it a way that we can handle populations so that they're not drawn into cities, that living conditions can be improved where they are? Well, even in those circumstances, we find the pattern, the demographic pattern, is that people continue to move to cities. Why do people move to cities? It's where opportunity lies, right? It's the congregation, the association, the proximity, and the opportunities that happen in urban areas. People will continue to move where it is perceived that the opportunities can occur. Now, in our time here in the United States, historically speaking, people moved to the city because that's where opportunity was. There were jobs. But what we look at in a number of low middle income countries is that when you move to the city, the opportunities are not there. And so what you see is an aggregation of people into urban slums. Now, people continue to move into cities. Why would they do that? Because if there's not a formal economy, there's an informal economy. And so 40% of city economies are informal. And what we see in looking at the rural comparison is that 40% of the income in urban areas is remittances to rural areas. So it's very important. Cities play such a crucial role in terms of what happens within countries. People are going to keep moving into cities. Now, we used to look at urban, rural, and say, you know what, health outcomes are much worse in rural areas than urban. But these were very aggregated data. And what we found is that as you progressively disaggregate the data, you find there are areas in the urban slums where the health outcomes are worse than the poverty in the rural area. So there are areas of wealth and there are areas of poverty that are proximate to each other. And we have to think about how is it that we address the healthcare issues and among many of the other issues, the food, the sanitation, and so forth, in those areas. But we have another issue, and you brought up the point of violence, and that is when you have the proximity of inequality, there is inequity, and there is the tensions that arise from that when you cannot ascribe, if you cannot access some of the goods that are available, the services. And so you're creating a very powerful environment for where tensions can occur. So what's the good news in all of this, right? Well, when we think of urban health and we think of cities, you think of the mega cities of 10 million people or more, right? But that represents just 5 to 7% of where the urban population lives. And what we're finding in megacities is that the rate of growth is slowing down. But what we find as we project more of the population moving to cities, it's 500,000 to 1 million. That's where the growth is occurring. And so what we see is that as growth is going to happen, there is time now for us to be able to plan and to be able to project and anticipate and put into place urban design programs, services as cities are growing. So growth is going to happen. It's going to happen in medium-sized cities, and we've got lessons from the mega cities. There's something we can do now. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Well, I think we had a very interesting lightning round of problem statements, but not a whole lot of solution statements that came with that. 5 minutes is hard to do both the problem and the solution. And I'd be very interested in having you guys challenge each other a bit with respect to solutions. And what I'd suggest is that underlying what many of you have spoken about is the issue of climate change. And there's no question that we could spend the rest of the time that we have talking about how we might collectively address climate change. But let's instead talk about the more proximate issues that you guys have raised. And let me just get some bit more of an idea from you about what are some of the solutions that respond to some of the problems that you have raised, leaving aside for a minute the climate solution, if you will, longer term. And just a couple of observations. I mean, David, you've talked about the increasing urbanization, which is, and certainly statistically, strongly associated with reductions in fertility, which will have a beneficial effect in the longer term on the problems that we're talking about, the ratio that Jenna brought up. The issue of urbanization also makes it easier to give people water and sanitation. You may have to bring the water from further, but the complexity of providing it, the proportion of people who live in urban areas who have water and sanitation is much higher than it is in rural areas. And what are the, I mean, Howard, you've suggested that if we ate a little bit more dog food and a little less people food, we'd be healthier. But I'd be interested a little bit more concretely in the sort of solution path to getting toward a more nutritious environment. And I'm not sure what to think about where we are directionally with respect to violence. And Ted, you were probably the furthest at thinking about solutions because scarcity implies violence. If we're not in a position where we can reduce scarcity, what can we do to have it result in less violence? And what I don't know is what the effect is of urbanization. I mean, David, you mentioned that, of course, it brings inequality into higher relief. But I don't know that that necessarily means that we see an association between urbanization and violence. And it'd be interesting to see how those things go together. One advantage of moving into cities is that while you may have increased, the disparities may be more visible, access to things like water may be better, and therefore there may be some counteracting effects. So in any particular order, who wants to say something about solutions? And I'd be especially interested in saying something about solutions about each other's problems and not just your own. But I see Howard raising his finger.
I don't think I ever said eat pet food. My comment was that if we only have one solution to a problem like plumpy nut, you might be better.
I was teasing you, Howard.
Yeah, I just want to make sure no one's thinking out there that's my suggestion. My suggestion is that there are multiple solutions to a problem, and we sometimes sit on our hands. But just think about aflatoxin for a second. 20 parts per billion is a recall. I don't know if any of you can speculate what that means in time, but it's 20 seconds in 32 years. 20 seconds, 1, 2, 3, Mississippi, so on. In 32 years is a recall. 40 kernels of corn in a typical bushel in Africa has 70,000 parts per billion. That's in 56 pounds. So why don't we defeat aflatoxin? Where's the effort? And I include my institution where I'm a guest, I should say, at UC Davis. How come the 4 institutions that are represented here don't say we're going to beat aflatoxin? We're going to figure out how to kill it in the soil. We're going to figure out how to eradicate it in storage. We're going to make sure it doesn't exist in the food system, because aflatoxin only causes liver cancer. Highest incidence of liver cancer in sub-Saharan Africa is Nigeria, directly related to aflatoxin. Stunting is related to aflatoxin. There's so many things if we went after aflatoxin. So we're starting to go after aflatoxin the same way we formed the African Orphan Crops Consortium to improve the nutrition in 101 food plants, including 14 trees, which are the most resilient sources of food in drought because they always will produce something you can eat. The other issue is that we have not placed our bet, and I'll talk just momentarily about climate change, on resilience. So whether it's resilience to aflatoxin or water use efficiency and nutrient use efficiency, and it's sometimes good to use an image. Anybody know how deep the soil is in most of sub-Saharan Africa? Raise your hand if you got a guess. No. It's about that thick. That's topsoil. Davis has 65 feet. The Ukraine has 200 feet in some places. So the entire thing that we're trying to fix, we're not doing it the right way. Where's the microbiomics of soil science? The same way that Jeff Gordon and Bruce German are working on the microbiome of the gut and mother's milk to be able to feed a child that looks like they're in trouble a combination of oligosaccharides that are really specifically set to work on nutrition in the gut. Where's the widespread press for that?
So Howard, does this mean you're mostly calling for increased investment in R&D?
And
most
translation.
Right. And most of that focus on how can we genetically modify organisms so they can be resistant to or not allow aflatoxin to grow on them, and how they can
that would be the easy way, but
put vitamin A into rice and
the
others.
Europeans will punish the people that grow those in Africa. So all of our work is on Mendelian genetics, as silly as it sounds, when you can jump ahead very quickly in other things. But yes, the investment to do that is so lacking by all the foundation structure, whether it's Rockefeller or Gates, and they know I think this about them, so don't call anybody up and say, you hear what Howard said? They already know it.
Now, what about the issue, you speak of nutritional security. Do you see the trend toward urbanization as being one that's beneficial or not?
Oh, no, I see that as truly the black hole of Calcutta. And I don't disagree with you about the smaller peri-urban cities of 500,000 to 1 million, but the problem till 2050 is you've got mega cities that are disasters. I mean, spend time in Nairobi, spend time any place in Africa, most of the cities in Latin America, certainly China and India. The disparity that you referred to, absolutely correct, between the haves and have-nots is so gargantuan that the biggest use of some of the monies are feeding programs for children. Some of the most heart-wrenching stories are seeing these small groups that are cooking food every day. There's a little piece that will come out from Google X, I think, about March, which talks about just this 2 or 3 hours in Nairobi looking at what is happening with groups who are trying to feed children. They're not even trying to feed adults. I mean, and violence is certainly a part of that reason. At least the children don't know the violence yet, so that they, with a full stomach, nutritionally driven, the violence between children drops off, and we are hoping they won't be stunted. I mean, it's a hope against very complex scenarios. So it's a global effort. To me, it's a crime against humanity not to fix stunting.
So Ted, what about what do you see as, you're an impact evaluation guy most of the time, or at least a lot of the time. What do you see as the solution set for addressing the violence issues?
I think there's a really wide range of things we could
that
go
relate
after.
to scarcity?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think you're right to maybe not go down the mitigation road. I mean, so one way to deal with climate change would be, reducing emissions, and maybe that's a whole nother discussion, although there was some news, from the U.S.-China, summit yesterday or something that seemed positive there. But there's a whole range of other adaptation approaches we could imagine. Some are technological and RD related. So, when we talk about, genetic engineering or genetically modified crops that are more drought resistant and more flood resistant, and there's a ton of work going into that now, and there could be more, but understanding the implications of those technologies in the field seems like a high priority. So there is work on this that's going on. And a lot more could be done there. So if we're able to develop crop varieties that are more drought resistant, that could be adopted, that people will use, that have an effect in the field, that'd be very attractive. That's one set of solutions. There's a whole nother set of more institutional solutions you could think of. So if we think that extreme inequality is a problem, there are redistributive programs governments can take to reduce inequality. So there are examples from Latin America and elsewhere that you're very familiar of cash transfer programs to the poor that could help make a dent in inequality. There are also programs that might be a bit subtler. There could be programs that respond to extreme climatic conditions. So in Tanzania, when there's a drought year, the government doesn't have in place a well-formulated set of programs for assisting affected areas. They don't say, okay, it's early in the season, the rains are starting to fail, we're identifying drought prone areas that may fall into extreme drought. Let's start moving food aid there. Let's implement public works programs or things like NREGA from India, employment guarantee programs. Those don't exist in most African countries, those kinds of programs. If they did, maybe we could head off some of the negative consequences of scarcity. So I think there's a set of economic policies, institutional changes we could envision that are complementary to the technological solutions.
Jen, I was in Washington the last couple of days, and one of the discussions I was in was somebody who was frustrated with the new government in India because the new prime minister's principal focus is water and sanitation. And the frustration was his lack of attention to health technologies that could be transformative in India, like rotavirus vaccine and things of that sort. I'm curious to know, as you see the trends going, you identified some of the problems, but actually I think yours was probably the most hopeful introduction in some ways with respect to the direct health effects of what people need for water and sanitation in their homes. Mm-hmm. What do you see as the importance of those 2.6 billion people without access to clean sanitation and the relative priority compared to some of these other things? I mean, Howard's been persuasively arguing about aflatoxin, and then you talk about 2.6 billion people who don't have access to a toilet, which is the bigger problem.
Well, I think, in my opinion, it's important not to pit these against each other. And I actually wanted to make the comment that there's a lot that sanitation can do for nutrition and vice versa. So Howard gave the specific case of India, right? 50% roughly of kids are stunted. Modi's come out and said sanitation is important. Is there any connection there? I think many of you are probably familiar with the work of Dean Spears of the Rice Institute. There was a story in the New York Times fairly recently. But he's using data analyzing data and finding that a very significant share, Ted, you may remember how much, of the variation in stunting rates can be explained by the density of open defecation. That is, how many people in your neighborhood don't have a toilet to use and therefore are going out in the bush. How would that relate to stunting? Well, stunting is primarily caused by two things, right? You're either not getting enough good nutrition in the first place, or your body can't use the nutrition in the food that you are taking up. And I think it's an open question, is the relative contribution of those two mechanisms. It depends on where you are. But in a place like India, which has a very high rate of open defecation, the fact that rates of stunting there are on par with much poorer regions, such as sub-Saharan Africa, right, is puzzling. And so what explains this? So over the past decade or so, there's been increasing support for a hypothesis that children who are constantly exposed to a fecally contaminated environment develop environmental enteropathy in their gut, right, which, although they're not coming down with acute cases of diarrhea, makes it really difficult for them to actually make use of the nutrients that is in the food that they're getting, right? And if that's the case, then we've sort of undervalued sanitation remarkably by focusing on the health outcome of cases of diarrhea, right? That's what we typically count. How often are kids coming down with severe diarrhea? And if this environmental enteropathy theory is correct, that's the wrong measure, right? So kids are constantly in this state of subclinical infection that is really reducing their ability to grow and to develop. So we're actually doing some of this work now to look at what's the relative contribution of water quality, water quantity, so washing your hands, and sanitation on these health and child development outcomes in Western Kenya. And the other point I wanted to make on the water side is that 95% of agriculture in sub-Saharan Africa is rain-fed. That's not very productive agriculture. So really small investments that allow for small shareholders to irrigate just a little bit, can radically transform what it is they're able to produce and consume themselves, as well as what they're able to sell in the market and earn some income, which is also a good thing for health, right? So I do think that going across, instead of nutrition versus water versus sanitation, thinking about where you've got connections that make sense is probably a much more, efficient way forward.
I'm glad you went that way in response to my question. Go ahead, Art.
It's a great point, and I wasn't opposing water in any way with aflatoxin or stunting. And the piece that you're referring to is very persuasive on many, many levels, which drives my comment about the microbiome of the gut and how one could inoculate it from those that are suffering the most and change it fairly radically. And there is good research at Davis and at WashU in St. Louis that is driving that. We need to start putting it into large-scale trials. And you look at the work and you say, well, this is cutting edge, but it's not so much cutting edge, it's cutting observations. The work is really quite profound from that way. And when you talk about this issue of water, one of the biggest issues is not having enough water, not capturing the water. So in Africa, when it rains really hard, with those of you who have been in sub-Saharan Africa know, there's no soil moisture holding capability. So what if you really were to capture all the water that fell into ponds and I couldn't agree more. I can change production of cacao with lousy germplasm, because we're the world's largest chocolate company. I'm quite interested in this tree. From 450 kilos to 1,500 kilos with basic irrigation. So if I can do it with a tree that is dead-end genetics, with a good genetics where I'm at 6,000 to 7,000 kilos with a really full irrigation system, imagine what you could do with spider plant or cocoa yams or teff or even maize that we send there to be grown that is really not adapted very well. So the issue of water and nutrition are inextricably linked. I wouldn't ever separate them. And this whole notion of what is possible, I think we've sort of fallen on our face a bit. Because what is the science fiction of the solution of these things? I'm sure that Borlaug and Swaminathan were thought of as visionaries when they came up with the Green Revolution. So what is the equivalent in what we're talking about collectively? And how do we get that to the forefront of the debate as opposed to sitting back in the science, which is in some ways academic?
I'm going to ask one more question, but I really would like some people to come up to the microphones. Are we recording? So do we want? Yeah. So we want people to use microphones, not because you may not have a voice that can be heard in the room, but just so we can get it on tape.
So as people are coming to the microphone, I wanted to build on the point that you brought out in terms of what are some of the strategies in terms of addressing some of these issues. And I did some work in Brazil, in Belo Horizonte, particularly doing a study on the participatory budgeting process that was there. And I was very impressed that here you have only a small part of a municipal budget, but there's a process in terms of political inclusion and participation and accountability that goes along with that, where when I went to some of the different communities, the favela, that you saw groups that had been opposing each other, violent, very violent with each other, but that in order to secure access to some of the resources, they would have to unify in order to build a proposal that could make the process happen for their particular community. So there were winners that came out of this, and it became models of responsibility within communities. So it was a small, as you say, redistribution of wealth, relatively minor, but saw a really major impact on that. The tone changed, not just in terms of being able to build on water sanitation, to have physical academies, gyms, and so forth, but also to then take on kinds of issues like violence, where you're bringing communities together, you're agreeing within the neighborhoods that this is an issue. And so how is it that you have a citizens' watch, bystander interventions, sort of norms in terms of the young men in communities? So that all, I think, arose from the sense that there was an openness to a political process that, again, just, I think, triggered a number of activities. And that Belo Horizonte wasn't the first place. It was, I guess, Porto Alegre. And now it's over 250 different communities as of a couple years ago. I think it's still increasing. I know there's one district in Chicago that adopted that. So it's made its way onto our soil.
Well, David, you were mentioning the phenomenon of urbanization before. And we've been talking a little bit here also about the inefficiency of smallholder agriculture. So when you speak about the phenomenon of urbanization, is this something that you point to because we have to adapt to it and we have to respond to it, or is it something we should seek to try to slow down? Because there are interventions. I mean, some of the ones that Ted has mentioned, when you put money into rural areas, you put resources in schools and food supply and things like that, people migrate less to urban areas. But it can be much more expensive to do that than to feed those same people or educate those same people if they're living closer together. If you reduce smallholder agriculture and have larger agriculture, you may have more efficient agriculture, but you also may go into monocrops and environmental threats and issues. What do you see as being, on balance here, are you suggesting that we need to really focus on how we adapt our responses to an increasingly urban world? Or are you suggesting that we really should be investing in reducing the rate of urbanization?
I think there's in my world, or in my sense, inevitability about urbanization. And the projects that are improving rural areas, I think, are very important. But there's also a component of that, which is of the people that go to urban areas sending remittances to the rural areas. So that is also factoring into maintaining the population. So it isn't just new wells, new hospitals, and so forth, but it's also people going to urban areas for the opportunities that economically help to sustain the rural areas. So it's a combination. I think because of that population trend, I think we have to really think about how do we make cities smarter. And some of that may be the physical design. Some of it is looking at what's the processes that we put in place, such as a participatory budgeting. What are some of the other kinds of ideas that we can make governance more effective? I don't really think it's a matter of programs as much, digging wells and so forth, as it is what are the policies that we need to put in place, and what's the process that makes it credible for those policies not only to take hold but to be sustained.
It's not like a Berkeley audience to not want to talk. It must be because Stanford's here.
Oh boy, that got him going.
That got Stanford up. So I have a question
But
about.
Michelle,
Is the mic on?
tell us who you are.
So Michelle Berry.
I'm just saying that because even though you were introduced, I want everybody to say who they are when they
Global
stand up.
Health at Stanford. I think it's very ironic that 50% of children are stunted in India when we're actually experiencing probably the largest obesity epidemic in the South Asian population. Can you spend a few seconds talking about nutrients and healthy nutrients and what nutrients can make a difference in this epidemic?
Well, I'm not a doctor. I'm a gene jockey who works in molecular biology. So I'm sure there's other people in the room who could speak much more eloquently. But I think that hollow calories, you can eat all the rice you want if it's not nutritionally enriched, and it won't give you what you need. And I think that's one of the things we're experiencing. And also the wealth that you're talking about, the illogical distribution or irregular distribution or unequal distribution, means that those children who are on the topper end of this are sitting around playing video games, and all the things that are affecting us are happening to them. I mean, the diabetes is going through the roof there, but also in the Middle East. I think Abu Dhabi has the highest percentage of diabetes per population anywhere in the world for that very reason. And as affluence comes, and I'm part of a large food company, so I'm talking about myself as well, what people choose to eat changes from the rural sector vitamin, maybe deficient, but vitamin or complex diet versus a simple diet. And that's certainly what's going on. There's a movement right now with ICRASAT, ICRAF, these are all CG centers, CIMMIT, IRRI, and Bioversity to set up a similar program in India for those food crops that need to be improved because they are the backbone outside of rice in the diet. But has any giant seed company improved rice nutritionally to really outside of golden rice? And that's vitamin A only. Or how about increasing the protein 2 or 3 times? Or besides vitamin A, zinc to stop cretinism. How do we think about these things? And it can't be done in a vacuum. You have to have the water. You have to have the nutrients to feed the crops. So India baffles me. I mean, it really does. It disappoints me the same way I'm disappointed we have 7% study in this country. And go to Greenville, Mississippi if you want to see a story that looks like West Africa or Southeast Asia, where lack of education, lack of diet, obesity is really running rampant there. We can't even fix our own backyard. Sometimes I'm embarrassed that I'm going to try to fix someone else's backyard. So it's so complicated at this point, but I can assure you the resources are not being allocated to fix it.
I'm tempted to dive in there, but we're going to go to our next microphone, please.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Pat. I'm from Aggie campus, and I know Howard. I think I see a common theme here between violence, the aflatoxins, the food security, smallholder agriculture, and the health, One Health. This is One Health Institute here. I think we are struggling here to exactly translate what we practice in our backyard in the developed world. So the pharmaceutical industry and the processed food industry that are here, we practice a principle of just by barrier. You don't let the moisture go in. But we don't practice that in the developing areas where about 80 million tons of grains is being lost annually, about 20 million in India, about 2.5 times of that one in China or in other humid regions. So the basic thing that's lacking here, and which as a institute we need to, as a global body, we need to go on is the management of moisture. we need to manage, we need to pack the food that's out there, not in the porous bag, but in a hermetic bag. So Kent, who is my mentor, he has called this a dry chain. You have heard the cold chain, but probably not the dry chain. So pack it when it's dry. If it's not dry, dry it down and pack it. So that should be the mantra for everybody. And as a institute, as a global body, if we move forward, then we can have the food available for several years, and when there is extreme weather or the violence. So we can link all of this, and then the aflatoxin, that, that's the biggest threat. 4.5 billion people being affected, as Howard says. And the stunting, all the 25, 30 nutrition, the health disorders that are there, it can be just addressed by, if we single-handedly address or target that humidity is the threat or the enemy for the dry food products. So
the paradox of the fact that lack of water is our biggest problem before harvest, and excess water is one of our biggest problems after harvest. Very interesting.
Thank you. My name is Alicia Graves. I got my MPH from Berkeley, and with Malcolm Potts, I co-founded the Oasis Initiative, which is organizing to advance solutions in the Sahel, which is a project of the School of Public Health and the College of Natural Resources. I know that there was sort of the suggestion that we shouldn't be prioritizing one solution over the other, and I appreciate that. I just wanted, as Ndola pointed out at the beginning, to remind us that population, people are the denominator in access to water and sanitation services, in food, of course, and in all of the things that people need in cities, like education and health services. My question is actually relates to the Sahel and to some of the points that were touched upon. I'd like to know, there's a push in the when people talk about resilience, people are, I'm thinking of Rockefeller and IFPRI, for example, recent calls that have come out looking for innovation and resilience, and innovation is important. But I'd like to know, what do you see as things that have already been proven at small scale that can work for smallholder farmers, particularly in Africa, that need to go to large scale, and if you have recommendations for that, I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
I assume you mean both production and storage, or reduction of wastage, or what were you specific?
I'm thinking more of production, but if people have comments on storage and distribution.
I guess the gene jockey is going to take that one.
Yeah. Well, dryland rice is certainly has to be at the top of the list for sub-Saharan Africa. Koulibaly Sangafo is the Minister of Agriculture in Cote d'Ivoire, and Akin Adesina is the Minister of Agriculture and Forestry in Nigeria, have made it, in many ways, their main priority to go for dry land type rices, which would reduce the water needs. And the number, we could argue a little bit, but 65 to 75%, with a loss of yield maybe 2 to 4%. The issue is it's genetically engineered. And I don't know how to do it otherwise, to be honest with you. I mean, I could spend 20 years probably, which is about what Erie has spent getting the sub-1 gene, which is an emergence gene, into rice traditionally. I don't think we have 20 years. That's the problem. And when you ask a group of people, do we have a moral imperative to feed everyone in the world? Everyone raises their hand. Do we have a moral imperative to protect biodiversity? Everyone in the room raises their hand. Do we have a moral imperative to use the best science possible to get that done? All the Europeans keep their hand down because of the precautionary principle. And at some point, there has to be this come to reason that these people are going to starve because of a precautionary principle. And I hope my legacy is not that I listen to the precautionary principle. So we're working on those kind of rices at UC Davis and at Erie and a few other places, at WARDA in Africa. And we're just going to have to do it. I don't see any choice to if rice is the big crop, and oddly nobody wants to eat fufu anymore or cassava. They're tired of it. They want white rice. I could tell them cassava's not bad, but I don't eat it every day.
I did for a while, and I understand that.
I eat it more than I want to, I have to say. It's tasteless,
On the
isn't
water
it?
side, real
So just a quick addition to
Just
that
a
on the
quick
water
addition.
side.
You probably already know about all of this, but this idea of just getting a little bit of water to a smallholder farmer can increase the number of rotations, can increase the diversity of what they're growing. And there are a number of programs and organizations that are doing different variations on how do you get a small amount of water to people. So Kickstart, their moneymaker treadle pump, is sort of that's marketed on a fair, quasi-commercial basis. There have been also some interesting projects around solar pumped irrigation systems for communally held fields, right? So in villages where the settlement pattern is, my house, my field over here, yours and yours over there, supplying each of us would be expensive. But if we can agree on a plot to set aside and work together, there have been organizations putting in these directly coupled solar pumping systems that then can irrigate those fields. So I'm happy to share more information with you on it, but there's a lot out there on that front.
But you got to capture the water, because pumping it, I've seen so many aquifers salinize very quickly by pumping it. If you can capture it, which is doable, we have good experience with that in the Central Highlands of Vietnam, to be able to water in the off-season.
Yeah.
Pat Conrad from the University of California, Davis School of Veterinary Medicine. I'd just like to commend the organizers and the panel and the moderator for a fascinating discussion. The question I have is maybe a little bit personal, but you all have so much expertise and so much experience in global health. I'd like to pose this individually to the members of the panel and maybe the moderator too. Let's say that suddenly you were given $100 million tax-free, okay, directly, to set up a foundation individually or collectively to really take global health action on a crowded earth. What would be your priority? How would you invest $100 million to address this problem, any problem that is your highest priority? Thank you.
Can I just modify that a tiny bit for the panel? To
You want me to give them more money?
No.
Oh. I can do that, theoretically.
No, but I was just going to say that you can only make one investment.
Yes, that's fine.
Right. In other words, this is a $100 million play. It's not a $100 million plays.
Right.
Well, she included you, so why don't you kick
No,
it?
I'm not going for. I'm moderating. I'm moderating first, and
Come on, you invited us.
and going next. But I see Ted nodding. He's anxious to go first.
Well, I want to, before I get there, say,
Oh, yes.
I'll have something to say about that. But I want to get back to sort of Steph's earlier point, and there's been some discussion of differences between how things work, say, in the U.S. and developing countries, and how maybe there's some commonalities. One of the things I didn't mention in my initial sort of lightning, round was the U.S. economy, it turns out, is sensitive to temperature and precipitation, and not just in the agricultural sector. So labor productivity falls at high temperatures. It's even stronger in agriculture, as you'd expect. And that sensitivity hasn't diminished over time. So we haven't, even in sort of the world's richest economy, haven't done a great job of adapting to warmer temperatures. The same thing holds in less developed countries. If you look at the sensitivity of extreme temperature, of GDP to extreme temperature, that relationship hasn't diminished over time. So it's a real challenge. So I think dealing with some of the extreme climatic conditions I was talking about, dealing with their economic consequences, trying to limit their consequences for violence is not a trivial problem. I want to go back to a very specific solution. So if I'm going to get back to the comment and focus on a sort of rural African setting where the rates of violence, civil conflict, et cetera, are high, where the sensitivity to temperature is extremely high because of the agrarian nature of the economy. I actually think in a lot of rural African settings, if we could implement good irrigation schemes, good water capture and irrigation schemes, that would actually go a long way towards solving a lot of the problems that I was talking about. So just going back to the initial example I gave in Western Tanzania, how in drought years there's dislocation and violence. If there were better water storage from year to year and it could be distributed, then the folks growing cotton, maize, and sorghum in that area, their crops wouldn't be devastated in a drought year. So So I think if I could put $100 million into irrigation in semi-arid regions, water capture and irrigation in semi-arid Africa, that would be sort of where I would go. But the solution would be different in different settings for sure. And I think research needs to be done to really understand what's going to work where.
So Howard looks anxious to go next.
I don't know if I'm anxious. I'm trying to figure out, could I split the $100 million in half and do 2 projects?
Nope, that's not the, that's wimping out.
Double down.
Double down. So when I was a reviewer for the Gates Grand Challenges, I picked the craziest projects that would come in because you were given 1 golden vote, which meant that whatever you chose for that, it would be funded even against their better judgment. And at that time, I funded everything that was on microbiomes because as I've grown to know Jeff Gordon at Washington U and David Mills at UC Davis and Bruce German at UC Davis and a few other people in this area, if I were a betting person, I would bet on that. But what I would use my $100 million for is nitrogen fixation in wheat, rice, and maize. To figure out how to get nitrogen fixation in those crops would go a long way. And it breaks my heart to have to only choose that, but I'll say that's what it would be, nitrogen fixation.
Jenna?
All right, I'm going to go with urban sanitation. Thinking about really viable models for urban sanitation that don't require 15,000 liters of potable water per person per year. I think that will have a lot of effects in the long term. In the short term, reducing exposure to pathogens transmitted via the fecal-oral route. In the long term, freeing up some of that water that we've been talking about is going to get more scarce per person, but also incidentally, creating models that wealthy countries are going to have to start looking at. So in other words, closed loop cycles where we are recovering water, we're recovering nutrients, we're recovering energy, and sort of having impacts both on public health directly through infectious disease, but indirectly through resource conservation, energy production, and energy production, period.
David?
Well, I was just thinking about that $100 million. Putting it into a program, it begins, it starts, it ends, and how broad of an impact. So I try to come back and say to myself, where can we invest that money? And some of it comes from the issues I've been talking about throughout the past hour and a half, is if people are moving into urban settings, what is that experience? How do you document that? What are the different interventions that people are doing that are rising up grassroots, for example, and then issues of governance? So I think about supporting the idea of having a network of urban health observatories that would be interacting with each other. And the idea is, when you watch what's happening, right, surveillance has a huge impact on behavior, right? We know that from hospital. I mean, there's just a lot of examples. So having a network of observatories, particularly in low middle income countries where the population rise and the urbanization is biggest challenge going forward, I think then you can start to take on some of these issues. They become informed, and you have people that are networking towards problem solutions.
So I'll just answer very quickly what I would say today, and it's probably influenced by where I am. But I would take aspects of all of this, but invest my $100 million in improving the kind of curriculum and educational materials that we can use through new educational technologies, so that these 4 universities and a number of others would be forced to work together to generate material that would be of service to the world, that could focus on all of these things.
And having $100 million, you can force me.
And, well, it's nice enough of a carrot.
Yeah.
So I've got two last questions, and then we're going to break for some, hopefully, fermented something.
Rice.
Thank you for these Northern California perspectives. My name is Ruth Landy. I'm a communication consultant, advocacy consultant for global health and nutrition. I think I heard the word gender once through your comment about older witches being the subject of violence in Tanzania. My question is, as the world develops its new compact for development for the sustainable goals, a blueprint, a global blueprint till 2030 over the next 9 months, I guess, how does gender factor into, and the situation of women and girls factor into your perspectives and your research going forward, both as a problem but also as an opportunity?
Who wants to say something first?
Well, oh, go ahead.
Dale.
No, take a genetic approach first.
It's ambiguous, what can I say? Prepared foods delivered to the rural sector that cook in 10 minutes versus hours and hours would reduce the securing of firewood or materials to use for fires, whether it's grain stalks. One of the worst forms of violence against young women is that. I consider inappropriate nutrition a form of violence against women. So if we were to fix the nutritional chain of young girls going towards pregnancy so their children weren't stunted, I would view that as a very big jump against this issue. Women produce, rurally in Africa, 70% of the food. So I'd want them to have nutritious food. There's a series of virtuous circles that could be done here.
Maybe I'll build on
That's
that
good.
since yes. So, and women, 77% of the women, the water that's carried is carried by women. So, just as an example, a specific example of how we're looking into a gender dimension to some of these questions is we realize that no one's really asked the question, how much does it cost in terms of human energy to do all of this water fetching, right? So the current paradigm in sub-Saharan Africa and in South Asia, when we make water supply investments to give more people access to, quote, improved water supply, what we're doing is putting in shared public taps, right, or shared hand pumps. We're not, actually the percentage of people who have a water connection at their home has not increased in South Asia or sub-Saharan Africa in the past 25 years, right? So we're building things where people still have to walk, fill up 45-pound containers, and walk home. And so one thing that I found sort of curious in the food security programs is there's a lot of emphasis on getting more calories to people, and no one thinking about where the calories are going or on what they've been spent. So we are actually have a PhD student right now in Mozambique who's strapping on bioharnesses on people as they go and fetch water to try and actually quantify what's the cost, what is the caloric cost here, and by and large it's being paid by women. It's just one example.
Nobody mentioned the issue of, this Gondola's not on the panel, of the relationship between status of women and access to contraception and ability to limit family size and things of that sort. But I suspect that if you took out the oil-rich Middle East, that it'd be a toss-up whether poverty or status of women was a bigger determinant of fertility today. But it's certainly an extremely important contributor. So last question to
Well, actually, you
take
took
us
the
into the
question out of
reception.
my mouth.
Who are you?
My name is Nuria Hodolugil. I'm the Associate Medical Director with VSI, which is an international women's health organization. And thank you very much for this excellent panel. So if I had $100 million, I would put it in family planning. Obviously, because, that's where
That's
I
what
work
you
right
do.
now. But, obviously, when there's a major problem, it has to be, addressed through different ways. But when I look at the title, it says Crowded Earth, and it also says population growth. So my question is, in your worlds, how is the conversation? What are people talking about in terms of, should we take it as a given, population growth? And if not, like in the field of reproductive health, we have come from population control to reproductive health, respecting women's rights. So we have some nuanced ways of bringing population into the discussion, not in some oppressive or old ways. But how is that playing out in your worlds? And what are, do you think, some of the nuanced approaches to bring population? That's the denominator, building on, what everybody else said. So what do you think? Thank you.
So can I actually make a suggestion? I'd like to give the last word to Ndola, and I think she's perfectly positioned to answer that question. So in giving you the last word and having you make a few closeout remarks, can you also take on our last question?
Well, thank you so much. It's really a great panel, and thank you for all for being here this afternoon. I will start by addressing a question, even though Pat didn't ask me, because I was just introducing part of the panel, but I will put my $100 million also in family planning. Thank you, Nuria. But trying to address Nuria's question, there are sort of because of rapid population growth and the history in the past, that somewhat tainted through the population control, etc., the field. It has been very difficult sometimes to talk about issues of population and given women's rights, specifically family planning and safe abortion. But I think that at least in the circles where I am, join sort of task forces and groups where the environmental groups, the nutritional groups are talking together, water, sanitation. The aspect of rapid population growth is coming back to the discussions, and in all of the projections, they do show as an important factor, not the only one, but an important factor that needs to be addressed. Now, there might be, or there still are, a lot of controversy related to how to address that rapid growth. Those of us working in reproductive health, we think that it would help to give women the right to control their own fertility through contraception, and with all other benefits that will come from it. But I think that we have come a long way to start addressing or mentioning population factor as an important aspect when we talk about crowded earth and how to address issues of the environment and public health. So, not to delay too much, I think that I don't want to summarize everything that was said here because it's still very fresh in our mind. Talking about the crowded earth, we talked about water scarcity, the sanitation, we talked about food scarcity, especially nutrition security that is important, issues of urbanization, increased inequality, violence, and all of those inextricably linked that have challenges that pose to us significant challenges that will continue to appear or increase with the population growth. Now, a lot of solutions were also proposed, including some of them when Steph was answering the questions of where you would put your $100 million. And some of those solutions, as Howard mentioned, would require, at least to address nutrition, improvement in crops, with significant increases in investments in research and development and also translation. Other solutions include better governance through policies, economic and institutional policies that can address violence, climate adaptation, cash transfers for the poor, programs that respond to climate-affected areas so the violence can be reduced. So I think that those are all important points that we have debated here today. We don't know for sure how the world is going to move forward with some of these potential solutions. But I would want us to continue this discussion within the universities in the Bay Areas and find a way of how to come together to provide the world with some important solutions and initiatives to start addressing some of these problems in a very large scale. So thank you very much for this opportunity. I also want to announce that the next Bay Area Global Health seminar is going to be at UC Davis in February, so please stay tuned, and so that we can continue to work together and provide the world with some solutions for our crowded Earth. Thank you.
Well. I'll just finish by thanking the panelists, Eva, Hildy, Ndola, and all of you for coming out. Thank you all so much.